Hello and welcome. I am your grumpy guide to all things gaming, the OGGM, with another OGGM history adventure. So, yesterday, as part of my take on RPG A Day 2020, we talked about the very first standalone published adventure, which was Palace of the Vampire Queen. 99.9% all agree that that was it, despite some few nebulous variations on that. But yeah. So today, let's talk about the adventure path. Now, most people think the first adventure path was Rise of the Rune Lords from Paizo, but that's not true because Paizo had two previous adventure paths. Two? Yeah, maybe three. Two that I know of. I think there might be three adventure paths that they actually did before Rise of the Rune Lord because they did Shackled City and they did another one about pirates that eventually became Skull and Shackles, but I don't remember the pirate one name, but I know it was an adventure path that they did in Dungeon Magazine. And even before that, there was the Githyanki Invasion adventure path, and even before that, there were other adventure paths. In fact, all an adventure path technically is a series of modules that are vaguely linked together. And if you've read some of the Paisio adventure paths, you can see that between module number 1 and module number 6, the connections are vague, if at best. Now, really, if you're following the rules of drama and Chekhov's gun, everything that you see in the first adventure path should be played out by the 6th adventure path. Chekhov's gun being the theory that if you see something, a gun, or something in the first scene or two of a movie or a play, you know that that thing is going to be used by the end of the play. That gun's going to be used. If you see that gun, but whatever. So, there's a long history of interconnected modules that you could claim are adventure paths. Pharaoh, Desolation of the, Underdark, the Giant series, whatever. Now, when we talk about the Giant series, that probably is the very first idea of an adventure path where you have a series of interconnected modules that create an ongoing story, each one building upon the last. You think you've reached the end, and then suddenly, whoop, pull back the curtain, and something's else. So most people think that the Against the Giants series, the G series, is Hill Giants, Fire Giants, Frost Giants, and then if you expand upon that, it's Hill Giants, Fire Giants, Frost Giants, Descent into the Earths, and then if you go even further, it's Hill Giants, Fire Giants, Frost Giants, Descent into the Earth, and then the Drow series, where we introduced the Drow for the very first time all the way back then. And they were backwards compatible because even though the Drow stuff came out after the original telling of the Giants, there were things that they said in the Drow series that linked back to the Giant series, so you could say, oh, well, really, it was this person all along. But if you go back even further to the way Gygax wrote it out, at least 90% sure this is what Gygax had in mind when he began the idea that would eventually become the G series. Now, we know that the G series introduced us to the Drow, and the Drow ended up becoming way more popular than TSR expected. So things changed to become more Drow-centric, especially when we started pointing pictures of Drow and big boobs Drow women in skin-tight bondage clothing on the covers going like, yeah! Well, yeah, that definitely shot the popularity of the Drow-related stuff out the roof. But on paper, the very first adventure path, the way Gygax wrote it or saw it in his mind from most of the research I've done, and I could be incorrect, but most of the research I've done was that Gygax never intended the Drow to be the main final bad guys of the Giant series. The way he wrote out the adventure path was that it began with Temple of Elemental Evil, even though Giants technically comes first, But really, it's Temple of Elemental Evil, Village of Hamlet in the way he wrote it in his mind. It's not the way we saw it published-wise, but it was the way he saw it in his mind. It was going to be Village of Hamlet, Temple of Elemental Evil. Then that would springboard to the Slaver series, S1, S2, S3, which would get the party some levels, would get them deal with, villains that worked as teams. You place them in a situation where suddenly all the stuff you got is gone and you have to start using your mind. Secret of the Slave Lords, the Slavery. Slavery would then lead to Hill Giant. Hill Giant being a much more akin to the chainmail, mentality of D&D back in the day, where, which is why a lot of people say it was probably written first, because the Giant series has a much more tactical feel, especially the original publications to it, than Temple of Elemental Evil or Slave Lords does. It's basically a bunch of guys going and trying to just sort of take out these giants, while these giants are turning around moving in this very militaristic fashion. You go into the giants, the hill giants, slaughter, 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 battle, 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 military, military, military. Oh, wait, there's more giants? Then we springboard to the next, the fire giants. Fire giants was next, right? Whatever, doesn't matter. You springboard to the next one, which were slightly tougher giants, slightly larger, slightly bigger, consequences. But oh no, there was another group of giants who were even behind those giants, and some, master plan and evil cloud giants and artifacts, and now we're pretty high level. So this is where things get a little fuzzy between what Gygax, at least what the writings I have found, claims what he wanted to do next after the end of Giants, and where things went. And it all sort of gets fuzzy where we have Descent into the Depths of the Earth. That's where the fuzziness begins, because that's where the Drow are introduced. And Gygax didn't want the Drow to be the main bad guys. They were an afterthought. And we're like, well, what's the evilest thing I can think of that would come out of the Underdark? Besides these weird shark people and lobster people and slime people, and who would be the masterminds, behind the masterminds? But that's, Ecladra and the Drow were just supposed to be a one-off. They were supposed to be a passing thing, because he wanted the real bad guys to be the elemental lords that were introduced in Temple of Elemental Evil. The way he wanted the adventure path to go, the Chekhov's gun of this series, this very first adventure path, the G series, was that the elemental lords introduced at, Temple of Elemental Evil would be the final bad guys behind the giants. You thought you got rid of them in Temple of Elemental Evil? Oh no, because it turns out now that you're 18th, 19th, 20th level, or whatever level you are at the end of the G series, and you've done this very, complex, militaristic series of modules, now you've got to deal with, things on a more cosmic level. You've got to deal with these elemental bad guys again. That's the way Gygax wanted it. But by the time we got to Descent to the Depths of the Earth, in the history of TSR and the history of TSR's relationship with Gygax, they wanted to go one way, Gygax wanted to go a different way. The Drow turned out to be way more popular than anybody expected it, so they wanted to push the Drow as the new big bad guys. They were behind the scenes of everything that happened in the Giant series. So we have, Fall to the Drow and Queen of the Demonwood Pit, and the introduction of Loth, and then Drizzt. And then once we introduced Drizzt, well, the world went Drow crazy, which is the topic of a different story. But the very first adventure path, as far as we can trace, being the Giant series, G1, G2, G3. Everything introduced in G1 plays out at the end of G3. Chekhov's gun. Everything that Gygax introduced in Temple of Elemental Evil and Village of Hamlet would have played out at the end of Descent of the Depths of the Earth. At least I think so, from all the research I've done. And I could be wrong. But that is the very first adventure path, as far as we know, is the G series. And everything Gygax had on paper for Village at Hamlet and Temple of Elemental Evil leading into the G series, and how the Slave Lord stuff was going to connect with the G series, and how that was going to lead to the descent of the death of the earth, and then that was going to lead to an inevitable Chekhov's gun. Everything I introduced here is going to play out over here. And a good adventure path, the idea of interconnected adventures, where everything you see in part 1 plays out in part 6, that is how an adventure path should work. And let's face it, some of the Paisio adventure paths are the best written stuff we've seen, and they do it amazingly well. I mean, Giant Slayer, Paisio's version of Against the Giants, is probably better than Against the Giants, and led to Wizards of the Coast doing Storm King's Thunder. If Paisio had not done Giant Slayer, Wizards of the Coast probably would not have done Storm King's Thunder. And Storm King's Thunder is also a retelling of the G series. That's how iconic the G series is it constantly gets retold over and over and over again. There's even another retelling of the G series called Howl from the North, though it doesn't really, it's the same story, but it deals with gnolls and dragonborn gnolls and demonic gnolls, and it deals with Yenagog and Tiamat at the very end, as opposed to it being, but it's basically the same story. And Giant Slayer, the Paisio Adventure Path, definitely an homage to the G series. And Storm King's Thunder, definitely an homage to the G series. So obviously that's why G series, being the very first adventure path, so important. It's constantly being retold in one form or another. That storyline is never going to not be played out in some way. In fact, I wouldn't be surprised if somehow it plays out in Rime of the Frost Maiden, since we know the Frost Giants are involved in Rime of the Frost Maiden, and story elements that were leaked in Storm King's Thunder are going to be played out in Rime of the Frost Maiden, which means story elements that we saw in G, where we first introduced to these organized Frost Giants, are being played out again over and over and over again. So that's the emblem, the emphasis of a good adventure path. That's why the G series is so iconic, because it's constantly being retold, and it's such a perfect example of Chekhov's gun. No matter whose version of the G series you're playing through, whether it's Gygax's, or it's the Independent, or it's Giant Slayer, Frost King's Thunder, whatever, the adventure path works when that Chekhov's gun works, where that everything that is introduced in the beginning, those first couple pages, plays out in the end, and everything has to work. If you see it in the adventure at the beginning, it's there for a reason, and it plays some part in the overall story, which means don't include it in your story if it doesn't serve a purpose that might be played out 6, 7, 8 episodes down the road. So there we go. The very convoluted history of the G series, the original adventure path, Gygax's version versus the version we finally saw. There's a lot more to it, because it involves the Drow and the fight between Gygax and TSR, and who wanted what and where, and blah, 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 and how Drizzt and the Drow and A.R. Salvatore. But that's not the point, and I've already talked too much. Talk to you later. Go Giants!